Hello, I'm Chris Copson. This is my bottom 5 list of tanks. Hope you enjoy it. It's very much a personal selection, so feel free to disagree.
This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members, and our Super Thanks donors. Please join them if you can, and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching.
Number 5 on my list is this, FV4004, the Conway gun tank. Now this is a tank that's the result of, to some extent, blind panic. 1945, the Berlin Victory Parade, Western observers get their first real glimpse of the IS-3, the Joseph Stalin III heavy tank. And they realise that is bigger and uglier and tougher than anything we've got, and it outclasses things like our Centurion. So there's a sudden rush to devise something to take on the IS-3 and later on the T-10. And there was a tank called Conqueror that was developed to do this. And the idea is that the heavy tank would sit a tactical bound behind the front line. If Russian heavy armour appears, it goes forward and sorts the problem out. The trouble is, Conqueror is not ready and won't be for quite a while. So what they do is to take an ordinary Mark III Centurion hull and stick a much bigger gun on it. And this is the 120mm gun that was going to be installed on Conqueror. The trouble is, what they've done is they've stuck a much bigger gun in a lash-up of a turret on a relatively small tank. And it really doesn't work. It's unstable, as you can see, it's high, it doesn't give much protection to the crew. There is a story going the rounds that if this gun is traversed to the side and you fire it on the wrong sort of ground, it'll actually knock the tank over. I don't know whether that's true, but in any case, the mounting is unstable, and this is a project that doesn't see the light of day. It simply doesn't work. Number 4 on my list is this. A lot of you will recognise this tank. It's very much one of the most admired tanks in our collection. This, of course, is the Jagd Tiger. Now, what about it? Well, it's got a massive 128mm gun. It has got 200mm of armour. It weighs 72 tonnes. The thing is an absolute brute. It is the most heavily armed and heavily armoured tank committed to battle by any side during World War II, and there's no evidence of one of these things being knocked out by enemy action. So, what's wrong with it? Well, the fundamental problem is that in the back of this thing is a poor little 600 horsepower Maybach HL230 engine, and that is the same engine that powers Tiger 1, which is 20 tonnes lighter. So you're expecting a relatively small engine to pull an enormous load. And that meant there were colossal problems with these things. They only made just over 80 of them, and most of them were lost either through breakdown or simply because they ran out of fuel, because they are unbelievably thirsty. If they break down, that's bad news, because they hadn't got anything that would recover a vehicle of this size. So they had to be left on the battlefield and blown up with demolition charges to stop them falling into enemy hands. Now, what this is all about is the German obsession, and I think it's coming from the top, from Mr. Hitler himself, building bigger and meatier and better armed and heavier tanks at the expense of mass production. Imagine the amount of labour that came into designing and building a handful of these things that wouldn't affect the war effort one way or the other. If you'd put that effort into producing something useful or getting the Panther right, it might have done some good. So a lot of people admire this tank. In my considered opinion, it's a heap of junk. It couldn't effectively do the job. Number 3 on my list is this. This is the British A9 cruiser tank. Now, the cruiser tank is a concept the British Army takes on in the years before World War II, and the idea is it's the tank equivalent of cavalry. So it's fast, it's relatively lightly armoured, and its advantage is mobility. So far, so good. How does this one do? Well, it's certainly quite quick. It'll do 25 miles an hour. It's got a 6-cylinder, 150 horsepower AEC engine in the back. It is really quite lightly armoured. The armour plate on this ranges between 9 and 15 millimetres. And this is one of the problems. It might be relatively quick, but if it comes across serious opposition, the armour protection simply isn't good enough. And these things, the cruiser tanks, suffered enormously in France in 1940. It's got a crew of 6, and looking at the front, it's hopelessly cluttered, isn't it? I mean, so far, turret, 2-pounder gun, that was a respectable tank gun for the period, but then you come down to the glacis, and you've got the driver's position, and then you've got 2 machine gun turrets. Now those are horrible and cramped. The crew actually called them dustbins, and it was like sitting in one. But my main problem with this is, you look at the front of the tank, it's difficult not to see somewhere that isn't a shot trap. Any incoming round is going to get funneled into the middle of the tank. It is an incredibly poor design. The British Army is a bit like this in 1940, I'm afraid. We have a whole range of different types of tank that we send to France. We have light tanks for reconnaissance, infantry tanks, slow-moving, heavily armoured to support infantry, and then we've got cruiser tanks. We haven't got one single decent medium tank that will fulfil a variety of roles. In my opinion, and feel free to disagree, I think it's a good thing that we had to leave a load of these things behind in France after Dunkirk, because it meant we had to go and find something better. So, number 2 on my list is this. This is the Matilda CDL, and CDL means Canal Defence Light, although that is actually a bit of a disguise, because this had nothing to do with defending canals. What this is a Matilda Mark II tank body, and you may remember the Matilda Mark II as an early war British tank with turret with a 2-pounder gun. The turret has been disappeared, and instead we've got this 6-sided replacement with a Beeson machine gun and a long slot just over on that side. Now what that is a 3 million candle power searchlight. And this is a peculiar contraption. Boney Fuller, JFC Fuller, had a lot to do with the inception of it. And this vehicle is designed to blind and disorientate an enemy during a nighttime operation. Searchlight itself, 3 million candle powers, that will project an area of light about 340 metres wide at 1,000 metres. Obviously, it is very, very bright indeed. You can make it flash twice a second, and they're actually issued with filters as well. So there's a blue filter and an amber filter. The amber filter, 2 amber filters, 2 tanks side by side, produce white light. The blue filter actually made the tank itself appear further away. So far, so good. Neat idea. The only problem is trying to find a use for it, which they couldn't. It was not effective enough. And these things, we ordered something like 300 of these for the British Army. The Americans converted about the same number of M3 mediums, but they saw practically no use during the war at all. The British used a number of these during the Rhine crossings, but they were ineffective. The US Army used them at the bridge at Remagen, and what they were trying to do was dazzle German frogmen who were trying to plant explosives to blow up the bridge. But I don't think that worked very well either. So this is a brilliant idea without a real purpose. Total waste of time, really. Number 1 on my list is this, and this is a British Mark II heavy tank from the First World War. Now, why have I included this in my list of bottom 5 tanks? Because it's not significantly better or worse in most ways than the other tanks that are in use at the same time, the Mark I, Mark IV, Mark V. They all have a crew of 8. It takes 4 people to actually just drive and steer the thing, and another 4 to fight it. They are vulnerable to artillery because the armour is relatively thin, and the engine sits in the middle of the fighting compartment, and it fills the air with carbon monoxide and makes it very, very nasty indeed. But what makes this uniquely awful is this tank doesn't even have the small degree of armour protection that the others had. This is a training tank, so it's boilerplate, not armour plate. It's never been proofed. So how do these things, training tanks, end up in combat? Well, you have to think back to the Battle of Arras, which is in the spring of 1917. Now, the tank's first appearance on the battlefield is in September 1916. There aren't many of them. We lose quite a few. We're desperate for tanks to put on the battlefield. So by the time of Arras, in the spring of the following year, we're so desperate we even commit the training tanks, despite the fact they don't have armour protection. Imagine going to war in a tank you do know for a fact won't really stop a bullet. And when you look at this tank, there are scars and dinks all over it. And round the back there are some quite spectacular hits from pieces of shell shrapnel that have gone right the way through. So you'd need to be pretty brave to actually do that. But Arras, I'm afraid, is a complete disaster in any case for the tanks. They get penned in behind a railway embankment, a place called Bullecourt. They don't achieve much of what they're setting out to do. And the Australians, who the tanks are supposed to be supporting, actually lose a lot of their faith in what they're thinking is a new wonder weapon. So Arras is a disaster, and one of those things, as I said, the fact we're committing unarmoured tanks to combat shows how desperate we are. If anything good comes out of it, it's the fact that quite a few of these tanks are left on the battlefield and actually captured by the German army, and they test fire against them. And that gives them probably an overweening idea of what will penetrate tank armour. So they think that their new armour-piercing SMK rounds will actually go through tank armour because they don't realise they've been firing at unarmoured tanks. Anyway, that's my number 1, the British Mark II Heavy. Well, that was my bottom 5 list of tanks. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe. And if you can, support us on Patreon.